We went to the meeting place of the association about 8:30 in an atmosphere of tension and impatience. The ground floor seemed to be a beer shop. Porter and other fine beers were on sale, but I did not notice any seats for consumers. We went through this shop and up a staircase into a room furnished with tables and benches which could accommodate about 200 people. 20 or so men were seated in little groups eating a very simple dinner or smoking one of the pipes of honor, of which there was one on each table, with their pot of beer in front of them. Others were still standing and the door was always opening to admit new arrivals. It was clear that the meeting would not begin for some time. The clothes were very proper. The behavior had a simplicity that did not exclude dignity, but most of the faces were evidently those of workers. The main language was German, but we could also hear French and English. At the end of the room there was a grand piano with some music books on it, and this, in a London that was so unmusical, showed us that we had come to the right place. We had been scarcely noticed and sat down at a table opposite the door. While waiting for Shopper, the friend who had invited us, we ordered porter and the traditional little penny packet of tobacco. Soon we saw a man enter who was tall and strong, a picture of health. He had a black mustache, a clear and penetrating look, and an imperious manner. He seemed to be about 36. He was introduced to me as Shopper. Shopper invited us to sit with him at the back of the room. On the way he showed me a poster with the heading, Statutes of the German Workers' Educational Union. The main principle of the union is that men can only come to liberty and self-consciousness by cultivating their intellectual faculties. Consequently, all the evening meetings are devoted to instruction. On one evening, English is taught, on another geography, on the third history, on the fourth, drawing and physics, on the fifth, singing, on the sixth, dancing, and on the seventh, communist politics. We sat in the places allotted to us. Meanwhile the room had filled up completely. The president, who was unknown to me, I was told he was a doctor, opened the meeting. When a solemn silence had been established and everyone had taken his pipe from his mouth, the secretary, a working tailor whose descriptive talent seemed to me to be truly enviable, declared that Citizen Shopper had invited Citizen Hildebrand and Citizen Diefenbach and asked if anyone had an objection to make. Then we went on to current politics and Citizen Shopper delivered a report on the week's events. His speech was eloquent, very detailed and full of interest. It was evident that he and the association had many sources of information. Naturally, a strong communist tendency was always plain, and the proletariat was the constant theme and the one real thread running through the entire speech. I admit that I can stand a good dose of liberalism, but certain passages made my hair stand on end. At first, the German communists in London had been under the influence of Cabot's peaceful utopian communism, following the failure of their attempt at a putsch in Paris in alliance with the Blanquists. Cabot had also persuaded them to give up their conspiratorial methods, though they necessarily remained a secret society. But they rejected Cabot's proposal to found a communist colony in America. By that time Weitling's influence had become important. But his notions of immediate revolution soon alienated the majority of the London communists, who began to be much influenced by their personal experience of Oneite schemes, by Chartism, and by the tangible success of the British trade unions. Weitling held the view that mankind is either always right or it never will be. Revolutions arise like storms, and no one can chart their operations beforehand. The intellect has only a poor role to play, and without emotion can do nothing. The greatest deeds are accomplished by the emotions that move the masses. Shopper's view, on the other hand, was that it is as easy to compel a tree to grow as to inculcate new ideas into mankind by force. Let us avoid physical violence. It is crude, and mankind does not need it. Let us view ourselves as leaves on the great tree of humanity, and posterity will reap what we with our calm activity have sown. This debate went on for several months in the meetings of the association, and Weitling was ably supported by Krieg, but the majority of the workers eventually sided with Shopper. The London communists had broken off all contact with Weitling by the time that Marx, in mid-May 1846, suggested that they form a communist correspondence bureau in regular liaison with Brussels. As early as March, Engels had formally asked Harney to act as correspondent with Brussels. But Harney, who had himself become a member of the League in February, insisted that Shopper and the leaders of the League be consulted first, suggesting that they were mistrustful of the literary characters in Brussels, and Marx's ideas were indeed far from popular with them. According to Shopper, and his letters reflected the views of the League leaders as a whole, revolutions could not be made to order, and a spiritual awakening would have to precede a physical uprising. The task of the League was seen by its leaders as one of enlightening the people and propaganda for the community of goods. They were also opposed to Marx's attitude to Krieg and complained of the intellectual arrogance of the Brussels communists. Schopper did agree, however, to Marx's proposal in July 1846 that a congress be held in London at some future date to hammer out differences and bring force and unity into our propaganda. As late as December 1846, Engels was suggesting to Marx in a letter, which is a good example of their intellectual arrogance, that they might have to let the correspondence with the Londoners drop quietly and try to reach some agreement with Harney. But it was clear that the German communists in London, in terms of numbers and organization, represented for Marx and Engels by far the most promising entree into working-class politics, particularly because Marx's various European correspondence committees never really got off the ground. In November, the Central Committee of the League of the Just, which had remained in Paris, was formally transferred to London. Together with the attempt at organizational reform that this implied, there was the growing feeling that, after the rejection of the communism of Cabot and Weitling, firmer theoretical foundations for the League were needed. On January 20, 1847, the London Correspondence Committee decided to send Moll, whose views were noticeably closer to Marx's than were Schopper's, to Brussels to solicit the help of Marx and invite him to join the League. Marx wrote later, "Whatever objections we had against this proposal were met by Moll's statement that the Central Committee planned to call together a Congress of the League in London. There, the critical position we had taken would be adopted in a public manifesto as the doctrine of the League. Antiquated and dissident views could only be counteracted by our personal collaboration, but this was only possible if we joined the League." Another condition that Marx laid down before joining was that everything that encouraged a superstitious attitude to authority be banished from the statutes of the League. Several other Brussels communists joined the League at the same time, as did Engels, whom Moll went on to visit in Paris. The London Central Committee demonstrated its willingness to change its ideas by issuing an address to members of the League in which they now called for a stricter definition of aims, rejected socialism based on pure sentiment, and condemned conspiratorial approaches to revolution. The promised Congress, which had in fact been summoned by the London Central Committee as early as November 1846 along extremely democratic lines, assembled in London from 2 to June 9, 1847. Marx did not attend, pleading lack of money, so Wolff went as a delegate of the Brussels Communists, and Engels represented the Parisians. It was decided to reorganize the democratic basis of the League, to change the name of the League to the Communist League, to emphasize the inappropriateness of the conspiratorial approach, and to issue a periodical. The first and last issue of this periodical, written mainly by Schopper and entitled Kommunistische Zeitung, appeared in September. In the new statutes, the previous slogan "All men are brothers" was replaced by "Proletarians of all countries unite." Marx was said to have declared that there were many men whose brother he wished on no account to be. Yet the statutes as a whole still represented a compromise between Marx's views and those of the London Communists. Their first article read, "The League aims at the abolition of man's enslavement by propagating the theory of the community of goods and by its implementation as soon as possible." A three-tiered structure was now proposed for the League: the Commune, the Circle Committee, comprising the chairman and treasurers of the relevant communes, and the Central Committee, together with an annual Congress, all officials being elected for 1 year and subject to instant recall. A draft confession of faith, drawn up by Engels, was circulated to the branches to be discussed at a second Congress in the following November. The success of the June Congress inspired Marx in early August formally to turn the Brussels Correspondence Committee into a branch of the Communist League with himself as president. It was the general practice of the League, which was a secret society, to set up non-clandestine workers' associations. In late August, a German workers' association was formed in Brussels with Karl Wallau, a typesetter, as president and Moses Hess as vice president. It had 37 members to begin with and increased rapidly. In addition to many social activities, there were lectures on Wednesdays, sometimes given by Marx, and a review of the week's politics on Sundays by Wilhelm Wolff. Marx was pleased with its quite parliamentary discussions and found the public activity that it afforded him infinitely refreshing. At the same time, Marx managed to secure ready access to a newspaper as a vehicle for his views. The Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung was published twice weekly from the beginning of 1847 by Adalbert von Bornstedt, who had previously edited Vorwärts in Paris. Bornstedt had been a spy for both the Prussians and the Austrians in the 1830s and early 1840s, and many in Brussels suspected that he was continuing those activities. However, the paper took on an increasingly radical and anti-Prussian tone. In April 1847 Wilhelm Wolff started contributing, and in September Marx began to write frequently, having come to an arrangement with Bornstedt that the paper would accept all contributions by himself and Engels. He complained bitterly to Herweg of criticism of this step from Germans who always have 1,000 words of wisdom up their sleeves to prove why they should once again let an opportunity slip by. An opportunity for doing something is nothing but a source of embarrassment for them. Marx contributed 2 important essays to the Deutsche Brüsseler Zeitung. One was a reply to an unsigned article in the Rheinischer Beobachter whose author Hermann Wagner, later the close associate of Bismarck, had tried to give the impression that the Prussian government was in favor of socialist and even communist measures, citing its recent proposals to shift the main tax burden from foodstuffs to incomes. Marx rejected the idea that the communists had anything to gain from supporting the government against the bourgeoisie. And insofar as Wagner appealed to the social principles of Christianity, Marx claimed that they merely transferred to heaven the task of repairing all infamies, and that this justified their continuation on earth. The social principles of Christianity preach cowardice, self-abasement, resignation, submission and humility, in short, all the characteristics of the canaille dash, but the proletariat is not prepared to let itself be treated as canaille, and it needs its courage, confidence, pride and independence even more than it needs its daily bread. The social principles of Christianity are sneaking and hypocritical, whilst the proletariat is revolutionary. In Germany, the proletariat had to ally itself with the bourgeoisie, for the aristocracy can only be overthrown by an alliance of the bourgeoisie and the people. Wagner was quite mistaken in arguing that the proletariat would be well advised to ally itself with the royal government, which was in reality its most dangerous rival. The real people, the proletarians, the small peasants and the rabble are, as Hobbes said, pure robustus sed maliciosus, and are not taken in by kings, whether they be fat or thin. This people would above all extract from His Majesty a constitution with universal suffrage, freedom of association, freedom of the press and other unpleasant things. The second of Marx's articles was a polemic against Heinzen, who commented later that Marx was the sort of man who brought up heavy artillery in order to smash a windowpane. Heinzen had written for the Rheinische Zeitung in 1842 and spent much time in Marx's company in 1845, but he attacked not only communism but also true socialism on his emigration to Switzerland, where he had become friendly with Rouge. Heinzen was a thoroughgoing Republican who saw the monarchy as the foundation of all social evil, to which the proclamation of a republic would put an end. In his reply to Heinzen, Marx stated that the political relationships of men are also social relationships, and analyzed the role played by the monarchy as a transitional institution between the old feudal classes and the nascent bourgeoisie. But the bourgeoisie was growing ever more powerful and already found itself in opposition to the proletariat. The solemn idea of humanity would never, as Heinzen hoped, cause classes to melt away. The task of the proletariat was to overthrow the political power that the bourgeoisie already has in its hands. They must themselves become a power, and first of all a revolutionary power. From 16 to September 18, 1847, a Congress of Professional Economists, in effect, a pressure group for free trade, was held in Brussels. Marx attended by invitation. George Worth was a dissident voice in declaring it a scandal that in all the eulogies they made of free trade there was no mention of the misery inflicted on the working class. Marx intended to deliver a speech in support of Worth, but the list of speakers was closed to prevent his intervention. Marx had once circulated his speech to several newspapers in Belgium and abroad, but only the small Brussels Atelier Démocratique would publish it. After analyzing the disastrous effect of free trade on the working class, Marx declared himself nevertheless in favor of it, because by free trade all economical laws, with their most astonishing contradictions, will act upon a larger scale, upon a greater extent of territory, upon the territory of the whole earth, and because from the unity of these contradictions into a single group, where they stand face to face, will result the struggle which will itself eventuate in the emancipation of the proletariat. On September 29 a dinner was held in order to inaugurate in Brussels what was to become the International Democratic Association, a body modeled on the Fraternal Democrats in London. At this time, many political meetings were held under the guise of dinners, as they were more difficult for the police to control. The dinner had been arranged on the initiative of Bornstedt. Marx had briefly gone to Maastricht to see his brother-in-law on family business. Although Engels regarded the holding of the dinner as an anti-communist move, he managed to be chosen as one of its vice presidents and also a member of the committee that was to establish the association. Engels promptly delegated his place to Marx and left for Paris, where he renewed his contacts with French socialists and Republican leaders, and Marx was duly chosen as vice president of the association. The association held meetings, established a number of branches in Belgium, and issued addresses on such subjects as the threat to freedom in Switzerland and the anniversary of the Polish Revolution. But Marx had other and more pressing business to attend to. At the end of October, he received a letter from the Central Committee of the Communist League in London telling him that the Congress had been put off until the end of November and urging him to attend in person. On November 27, Marx left Brussels in the company of Wirth and Victor Tedesco. He met Engels at Ostend on the 28th and, with Tedesco, they crossed the Channel on the 29th. Ostensibly, Marx went as a delegate of the Democratic Association to attend a meeting of the Fraternal Democrats in celebration of the Polish Uprising of 1830. The evening after his arrival in London, Marx duly delivered an energetic speech to the Fraternal Democrats, meeting in the headquarters of the German Workers' Educational Association at 20 Great Windmill Street, near Piccadilly. The downfall of the established order, he told them, is no loss for those who have nothing to lose in the old society, and this is the case in all countries for the great majority. They have, rather, everything to gain from the collapse of the old society, which is the condition for the building of a new society no longer based on class opposition. Marx concluded by proposing Brussels as the venue for the following year's meeting, but this proposal was overtaken by events. The next day, in the same building, the Second Congress of the Communist League began. According to Engels, Marx defended the new theory during fairly lengthy debates. All opposition and doubt was at last overcome and the new principles were unanimously accepted. The debates lasted a full 10 days, during which new statutes were drawn up making it quite clear that the Communist League, although necessarily operating largely in secret, was to have a democratic structure ultimately dependent on an annual Congress and have as its principal purpose the propagation of publicly declared doctrines. The statutes adopted in June with their somewhat utopian notions of community of goods were set aside, and the aims of the League were proclaimed as the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the domination of the proletariat, the abolition of the old bourgeois society based on class antagonisms, and the establishment of a new society without classes and without private property. At the end of the Congress, Marx and Engels were given the task of writing a manifesto to publicize the doctrines of the League. There are no surviving records of these discussions, but the following vivid description of the impression made by Marx at that time was written much later by Friedrich Lessner. Marx was then still a young man, about 28 years old, but he greatly impressed us all. He was of medium height, broad-shouldered, powerful in build, and vigorous in his movements. His forehead was high and finely shaped, his hair thick and pitch black, his gaze piercing. His mouth already had the sarcastic curl that his opponents feared so much. Marx was a born leader of the people. His speech was brief, convincing and compelling in its logic. He never said a superfluous word, every sentence contained an idea, and every idea was an essential link in the chain of his argument. Marx had nothing of the dreamer about him. The more I realized the difference between the communism of Weitling's time and that of the Communist Manifesto, the more clearly I saw that Marx represented the manhood of socialist thought. On his return to Brussels, Marx had little time to compose his manifesto. He immediately began to give a course of lectures on wages to the German Workers' Educational Association. Here Marx was chiefly concerned to go beyond the idea of capital as simply composed of raw materials, instruments of production, and so forth. He insisted that it was only in given social conditions that such things constituted capital. Capital, also, is a social relation of production. It is a bourgeois production relation, a production relation of bourgeois society. Are not the means of subsistence, the instrument of labor, the raw materials of which capital consists, produced and accumulated under given social conditions, in definite social relations? Are they not utilized for new production under given social conditions, in definite social relations? And is it not just this definite social character which turns the products necessary to new production into capital? In order for capital to exist, there had to be a class which possesses nothing but its capacity for labor. Capital and wage labor were complementary in function and entirely opposed in interest. Although for a time working conditions might improve, this only meant that the working class could consider itself content with forging for itself the golden chains by which the bourgeoisie drags it in its wake. And Marx went on to issue a categorical statement to be revised in his later works that with the increase in productive capacity and machinery, wages would fall. In February, Marx started writing up these lectures for publication, but was to be interrupted by his expulsion from Belgium. Marx was also active in the Democratic Association, to which, on his return to Brussels, he read the reply from the Fraternal Democrats that declared, "Your representative, our friend and brother Marx, will tell you with what enthusiasm we welcomed his appearance and the reading of your address." All eyes shone with joy, all voices shouted a welcome, and all hands stretched out fraternally to your representative. We accept with the liveliest feelings of satisfaction the alliance you have offered us. Marx helped to found a new branch in Ghent and was prominent in the meeting to celebrate the new year, where Jenny was complimented on her social capacity. It was on one of these occasions, too, that Jenny Marx refused categorically to be introduced to Mary Burns, Engels's mistress, whom Engels had had the temerity to bring with him. Stephen Bourne recalled that, in matters of honor and purity of morals, the noble lady was intransigent. He also introduced Bakunin and Dester into the Democratic Association. Bakunin, however, would have nothing to do with the League or even with the Workers' Association. In his view, Marx was spoiling the workers by making logic choppers of them, and it was impossible to breathe freely in the company of Marx and Engels. Nevertheless, Marx managed to get his ideas across to the Democratic Association in his speech on free trade he delivered on January 9. It was along the same lines as one that he would have delivered at the September Economic Congress, had he been allowed to speak. He summed up his thesis as follows: "At the present time, the system of protection is conservative, whereas the system of free trade is destructive. It dissolves old nationalities and pushes to the extreme the antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat. In a word, the system of commercial freedom hastens the social revolution." Meanwhile, Marx had been working on the manifesto. The London Communists had supplied him with a sheaf of material that included at least 3 separate tentative drafts for the manifesto. Engels had composed a draft incorporating the views of the First League Congress in June 1847, and this draft was discussed in the various groups in late summer and autumn. Moses Hess had proposed an alternative version which Engels ironically described as divinely improved. Hess's version does not survive, but 2 confessions of faith that he composed around this time show differences from Marx and Engels, both in ideas, in that Hess believed in appealing to eternal principles to justify his policies, and in tactics, in that Hess considered that the next revolution should be a proletarian one. On behalf of the League's Paris branch, Engels produced a 3rd draft of which he wrote to Marx just before they left for London. Think over the confession of faith a bit. I think it would be better to drop the catechistic form and call the thing a communist manifesto. As a certain amount of history will have to be brought in, I think the present form is unsuitable. I am bringing along what I have done here. It is in simple narrative form, but miserably edited and done in a terrible hurry. This draft, entitled Principles of Communism, a catechism of 25 questions and answers, was drawn on quite extensively by Marx. In places, however, there is a noticeable difference between the optimistic, determinist approach of Engels, which stemmed from the Enlightenment and his experiences in industrial England, and the greater emphasis given by Marx to politics in the light of experiences of the French working class. Engels said later that it was essentially Marx's work and that the basic thought belongs solely and exclusively to Marx. Notwithstanding the appearance of their 2 names on the title page and the persistent assumption about joint authorship, the actual writing of the Communist Manifesto was done exclusively by Marx. The Communist Manifesto has 4 sections. The first section gives a history of society as class society since the Middle Ages and ends with a prophecy of the victory of the proletariat over the present ruling class, the bourgeoisie. The second section describes the position of communists within the proletarian class, rejects bourgeois objections to communism, and then characterizes the communist revolution, the measures to be taken by the victorious proletariat, and the nature of the future communist society. The third section contains an extended criticism of other types of socialism: reactionary, bourgeois, and utopian. The final section contains a short description of communist tactics towards other opposition parties and finishes with an appeal for proletarian unity. The opening words typify Marx's approach to history. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles: freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman. In a word, oppressor and oppressed stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. The present age, he continued, in a passage that summarized conclusions reached in the first part of the German ideology, was unique in that class antagonisms had been so simplified that there were now 2 hostile camps facing each other: bourgeoisie and proletariat. The bourgeoisie, from its origins in feudal society, helped by the discovery of America, the development of a world market and modern industry, had everywhere imposed the domination of its class and its ideas. In a well-known phrase that fitted contemporary France more than any other country, Marx described the modern state as merely a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Historically, the bourgeoisie had been a most revolutionary class. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. But this progress had to continue. The bourgeoisie could not exist without constantly revolutionizing the means of production. And just as the bourgeoisie had caused the downfall of feudal society, so now they were preparing their own downfall, like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For the bourgeoisie had not only forged the weapons of their destruction, they had also created, in the proletariat, the men who were to wield those weapons. Marx then described the revolutionary nature of the proletariat. Workers had become mere appendages of machines. To the extent that the use of machinery and division of labor increased, so the wages of the workers got less in spite of the longer hours they worked. The lower middle class was forced down into the proletariat. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. Thus the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat itself went through several stages. At first their principal aim had been to restore to the working man the status he had lost since the Middle Ages. With increase of numbers, they began to form trade unions. Finally, the class struggle became a political struggle. As the struggle neared its decisive hour, a process of dissolution set in within the ruling class, and a small section, of bourgeois ideologists in particular, went over to the proletariat. No other class in society could fulfill the revolutionary role of the proletariat. The lower middle class were in fact reactionary in that they tried to roll back the wheel of history, and the dangerous class, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lower layers of society, was ripe for bribery by reactionary intrigue. Marx summed up this section with the words, "The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers, due to competition, by their revolutionary combination, due to association." The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie, therefore, produces, above all, is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Obviously, Marx was here projecting into the future tendencies he saw at work in the present. In Germany at that time, the proletariat in fact comprised less than 5% of the population, and even in England the rule of the bourgeoisie was far from being universal. In the second section, Marx raised the question of the relationship of the communists to the proletariat as a whole. The communists were not opposed to other working class parties. Their interests were those of the proletariat as a whole. Two factors distinguished them from other working class groups: they were international, and they understood the significance of the proletarian movement. Communist ideas were not invented or discovered, they merely expressed actual relations springing from an existing class struggle and could be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. Marx then dealt with objections. The first objection was that communists desired to abolish the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor. His reply was that the property of the petty artisan and small farmer was being abolished anyway by the power of capital. The proletariat did not have any property, and capital, being a collective product and the result of the united action of all members of society, should be owned collectively. Private property was bourgeois property, and all arguments against its abolition were bourgeois arguments. Similarly, in reply to a second criticism, he argued that the abolition of the family meant the abolition of the bourgeois family, whose counterpart was the practical absence of family life among proletarians, and public prostitution. To meet a third objection, Marx maintained that the real point about the so-called community of women was to do away with the status of Karl Marx, a biograph human as mere instruments of production. The present system was merely public and private prostitution. It was also said that communists wished to abolish countries and nationality. But working men had no country. Modern industry was abolishing national differences and, with the disappearance of class antagonisms, hostility between nations would also end. Sweeping value-laden condemnation of communism was not worthy, in Marx's view, of serious consideration. In a passage which minimized to the point of caricature the role of ideas in society, Marx asked, does it require intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. Having dealt with these objections, Marx outlined the measures that would be taken by the proletariat once it had become the ruling class. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e. of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. In a section that was very largely inspired by Engels' draft, there followed a program which included the abolition of landed property and inheritance, the imposition of income tax, the centralization of credit and communications, state ownership of factories, and free education. He concluded, when, in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organized power of one class for oppressing another. If the proletariat, during its contest with the bourgeoisie, is compelled, by the force of circumstances, to organize itself as a class, if, by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and as such, sweeps away by force the old condition of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonisms and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class, i.e. in place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms. We shall have an association, in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Of the third section of the Communist Manifesto contained criticism of three types of socialism: reactionary, bourgeois, and utopian. The first was a feudal socialism preached by the aristocracy to revenge themselves on the bourgeoisie who had supplanted them as the ruling class. Hand in hand with feudal socialism went Christian socialism, which Marx simply dismissed as the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heartburnings of the aristocrat. The second type, petty bourgeois socialism, was chiefly represented by the French economist Sismondi. This school had well analyzed the contradictions inherent in modern methods of production, but in its positive proposals it was reactionary, wishing to restore corporate guilds in manufacture and patriarchal relations in agriculture. The third party, labeled by Marx reactionary socialists, were the true socialists. These were the German philosophers, mainly the followers of Feuerbach, who had emasculated French socialism by turning it into a metaphysical system. This was inevitable in an economically backward country like Germany, where ideas tended not to reflect the struggle of one class with another. These philosophers thus claimed to represent not true requirements, but the requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. In the Manifesto's review of socialist and communist literature, the second section, devoted to bourgeois socialism, was short. Proudhon was the main representative of this tendency, and Marx had already devoted considerable space to examining his theories. Here he confined himself to observing that the socialistic bourgeois want all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. Thus the reforms advocated by these socialists in no respect affected the relations between capital and labor, but they did at least lessen the cost and simplified the administrative work of bourgeois government. The final school discussed was the critical utopian school, represented by such writers as Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen. It originated during the early, inchoate period of the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. These writers had perceived class antagonisms, but in their time the proletariat was still insufficiently developed to be a credible force for social change. Hence they wished to attain their ends by peaceful means and small-scale experiments, rejecting political and in particular revolutionary action. Their utopias, envisaged at a time when the proletariat was still underdeveloped, correspond with the first instinctive yearnings of that class for a general reconstruction of society. But at the same time, these utopian writings also contained critical elements. Since they attacked every principle of existing society, they were full of insights valuable to the enlightenment of the working class. But as the modern class struggle gathered strength, these utopian solutions lost all practical value or theoretical justification. Thus, although the originators of these systems were, in many respects, revolutionary, their disciples have, in every case, formed mere reactionary sects. The fourth and concluding section of the manifesto dealt with the attitude of communists to various opposition parties. In France, they supported the Social Democrats, in Switzerland the Radicals, in Poland the peasant revolutionaries, in Germany the bourgeoisie. Nevertheless, in Germany, they never ceased to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the inherent antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat. The communists directed their attention chiefly to Germany, which they believed to be on the eve of a bourgeois revolution. The manifesto ended to the communists' disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. In a sense, of course, virtually all the ideas contained in the Communist Manifesto had been enunciated before, particularly among French socialists, in whose tradition the manifesto is firmly situated. Beauboeuf's ideas on revolution, Saint-Simon's periodization of history and emphasis on industry, Considerance manifest, all inspired aspects of Marx's work. And Lai himself was the first to admit that the concept he began with, that of class, was used long before by French bourgeois historians. But the powerful, all-embracing synthesis and the consistently materialist approach were quite new. The manifesto was a propaganda document hurriedly issued on the eve of a revolution. Marx and Engels considered in 1872 that the general principles expounded in the document are on the whole as correct today as ever, though they would doubtless have modified radically some of its ideas, particularly, in the light of the Paris Commune, those relating to the proletariat's taking over of the state apparatus and the rather simplistic statements on pauperization and class polarization. For all the clarity and force that later made it a classic, the publication of the manifesto went virtually unnoticed. Before it was off the presses, the 1848 revolutions had already begun. Cologne.no, German newspaper, before or since, has ever had the same power and influence or been able to electrify the proletarian masses as effectively as the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. And that it owed above all to Marx. F. Engels, Marx and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, MESW 11 305.